All right, today we're going to dive into mythic dungeons in the War Within. Now, I've seen a lot of tier lists for best DPS, best tank, best this, best that, but nobody's talking about the dungeons. And as a Mythic Plus player, that's probably the most important going into this expansion. So I want to do a review on the dungeons, kind of just talk about how they feel. Like always, it's beta, so when I get into this is too strong, this is overtuned, all that's going to change. So I don't want to lean too far into that and say a dungeon's bad because it's overtuned and so on and so forth. So we're just going to talk about how it feels to go through these dungeons. First, I want to start with Mist of Tirna Scithe. The dungeon's got some interesting mechanics, but a few areas that could use improvement. One of the first things I noticed going in is the big ads that cause Bramble. Sometimes Bramble's easy to miss. It can be frustrating and hectic pulls when all of a sudden you're slowed and you can't really move out of it. I know that it has a very good visual once you move, but I feel like when it's under the mob or you're in the water on like that second pull that you can skip, it just becomes a little bit hard to find where it's coming from. But if you keep moving, it's not too bad. The next part of the dungeon that I don't understand why they kept it the way it was is the Covenant Gates. Currently, not all classes can open them, which feels a bit restrictive. I wish they would expand it to different classes and different races, and that way it's a little bit more welcoming to everybody. Because before, when you could pick your Covenant, it didn't matter what race or class you were in, you could always pick that Covenant, so everybody had access to it. But now when you're going to limit it to just Night Elves and just Taurens, it's extremely limiting. Leading up to the first boss, there's not a lot of stuff to talk about. Typical trash, the Bramble's kind of annoying, but other than that, it's your standard Mist of Tirna Scithe. Once you get to the first boss, again, boss is fine. I don't think there's any issues with him. You nuke down the one guy, you kill him when he starts channeling into the other guy. It's what it's always been. It doesn't feel like they've changed a lot of it, and I think that that's fine. Now let's talk about the maze. It's a love-hate relationship for a lot of people, me in particular. I like it. I think it's a cool concept, but it can be very annoying if you have somebody running into the wrong cloud over and over and over again. I think the concept's fun. It adds a nice unique challenge, but it can feel a bit tedious. And there's always one time in that maze where I'm looking at all the icons and I'm like, it's 100% that one or that one. And it's like a 50-50 toss-up. And I understand that it's the one that's unique, but sometimes it's like they're close. So, but other than that, I personally like the maze. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but I do know that it can be annoying. It can be a pain in the ass if you have somebody just running into clouds. Once you're in the maze, the dungeon's particularly punishing to melee players, of course. The small AoE circles often push melee out, and unlike before, you can't stop the cast from outside these circles because we lost all of our range. It forces melee to constantly reposition, making it difficult to stay on target. They made a couple changes and removed Spear Flurry, which was a good move, but the new mechanics they introduced just feel like a different obstacle for melee. The big AoE attacks are an issue. They take melee out of the fight, they can't be stopped, and you have to constantly keep moving. The charge can be stopped, which is the only one that affects range, so that doesn't make any sense. And the Anima Slash, that thing does a shit ton of damage. If you get 2 stacks on you, you take some serious damage fast, and I wasn't expecting it the first time I went in after the changes, and it was all of a sudden like, what the hell just hit me? And then I realized it's that doing 800k a second. So I don't know if the Anima Slash, I don't know if those changes were necessary, but it is what it is. The second boss also needs some tweaking. The Fox should spawn away from melee. If you have an all melee group, it doesn't make sense that it spawns directly underneath you and can immediately freeze everyone. Melee is punished in every dungeon. The least they could do is not let a mechanic spawn underneath them. A bit of repositioning would go a long way here. Additionally, the spawn points in the dungeon. The spawn points are tied to the Covenant Gates, which is now only locked to Tauren and Night Elf, and they have to activate the acorns. Cool, it's unique, it's different, but it's the only dungeon that has spawn points based on specific races, and it feels very out of place. It was fine when everybody could be Night Fae, but now there's only 2 that can do it. Take it out, let everybody do it. The trash from the second boss to the last boss is manageable. It's a bit strong, but it's always been a bit strong. It's always been the harder trash of the dungeon, so I think it's fine. I know it does a lot of AoE damage. You need to have your stops and your interrupts and your kicks going, but if you do, you can manage it pretty easily. I know I wasn't gonna talk about numbers, but I think a lot of the numbers that we deal with where they say, oh, this is too strong, this is too that, let's do that, we're also scaled down to 580, which is awfully low. So I think when we go in there with actual gear, it's not going to feel as detrimental. Now, they did make some changes to the last boss. They feel fine. I think it's just they pull you in on that one move and you have to run out. Not necessarily a big deal. Half the time somebody's got to run out anyways because they're mind linked. So it didn't feel like that was a new and challenging part of the fight. it just felt like I was already moving out anyways. So overall, I personally love this dungeon, but it could use a few tweaks, and I would love for it to be melee friendly and a little less restrictive on what classes can do in there. I had it in my S tier until the recent changes, and now it's probably A tier for melee and still S tier for casters. Next up is Necrotic Wake, and it's one of my favorite dungeons in the expansion. The weapons and shield power-ups you can find throughout the dungeon are a nice touch, offering a nice boost without feeling overpowered. They add a strategic layer to the gameplay, which I really enjoy. It kind of gives you some more freedom in what you're going to pull based on the weapon you currently have, whether it's anima orbs or shield or spear, whatever it may be. It adds for a little bit of variety in the dungeon. However, some of the trashbacks are a bit strong, especially with the recent stop/kick changes. I think this is more of a numbers issue than a design flaw, and I'm confident it can be balanced out, but you'll see a running theme throughout the dungeon where the recent changes to stops and kicks make dungeons more or less enjoyable. The first boss in Necrotic Wake is fine. It spits up those wretches, you kill them and move. It's a pretty simple boss, pretty simple mechanics, but I think it's a solid first boss. One area that could use improvement is in the second boss's layout. It feels a bit too spread out, which can be a hassle. I'd like it to be based on player position and not random, offering some counterplay that doesn't involve solely interrupting 6 mobs. Condensing this area would just make the fight flow better. Additionally, the angels gotta work, man. Currently, they're extremely unreliable, which is frustrating to test in the beta. It makes you not want to go into the dungeon knowing that the angels could not work. And I know it's beta and I know it'll be fixed, but please fix it so we can test that dungeon a little bit more and not worry about, oh, somebody died, GG, dungeon's over. So angels gotta work. Moving up to the second floor, the mobs up top should have a better animation for frontals like Mutilate. Clearer animations would help players react more effectively and avoid unnecessary damage. Fixate alerts could also be more prominent. Right now, they can be easy to miss in the heat of battle, and I think an interesting way that could fix this is knock back the fixated target before you start chasing them. It wouldn't apply to casters because they're already out, but it would give melee that second to get away that they need. They're not terribly glaring issues, but it would be just a nice quality of life change. The last boss feels balanced and challenging and in kind of a fun way. You have the little mini game if you get pulled down, which can be annoying, but it's all right. It's a nice little break from the fight. And then I like the Comet Storm, having to move. And if you just move, people overreact for Comet Storm. You can literally take a step back, a step to the right, a step forward, a step left, a step back, and you can stay within melee range and avoid the Comet Storm. So don't go running in a circle past your tank or running past your healer. Just do a small circle where you are and you'll avoid the Comet Storm. Overall, Necrotic Wake's a solid dungeon with a few minor pulls that need tweaking. It's a great example of how power-ups can be integrated into dungeon design without breaking the game's balance. Now, maybe it's a hot take, but I'm putting Necrotic Wake in S tier. It's probably my favorite dungeon. It doesn't feel outwardly punishing for range or melee. There's parts throughout the dungeon that benefit both. The mobs that jump around in the beginning favor a melee group. Even casters have to run inside to work against that. While the second boss favors range, where you need to go out and interrupt mobs that are way out there or kill mobs that are far away from the boss. And it has kind of that balance throughout. The weapons add a layer of strategy I like, and the bosses are fun. Last boss is probably a 50-50 toss up on if you like it or not, but overall I think the bosses are enjoyable. So S tier for Necrotic Wake. Next up, Siege of Boralus. Siege of Boralus is a dungeon that I've always liked despite its mixed reception in the community. It does feel a bit overtuned, specifically in that pull-in ability and the Teethbreaker ability. Sometimes they combo up and they can just nuke you, but these are just numbers and they can be tweaked, so I'm not too concerned about them. One significant challenge here is the needs for stops and interrupts throughout a pull makes it much harder to stop the runner from running out and grabbing another pack. You'd spend all your interrupts, you spend all your stuns trying to stop cast from going off, and then you have one guy running out and there's nothing you can do about it. It leads to a lot of accidental pulls and can be frustrating. I think of right before the first boss, the Hangman area, there's always a mob that runs away and pulls the rest, and you've already spent all your stuns trying to stop casts, and that guy always gets away, and that's just frustrating and annoying. Another thing that needs to be adjusted is line of sight pulls in this dungeon. Sometimes are a hit or miss. Sometimes you feel like you can LOS and they come running over. Other times they yank you and your party to them, which defeats the purpose. Sometimes I'll run around a fence, they all come over, we fight happily. Other times I'm the only one to start the pull while my party is behind me, and I run back and everyone still gets yanked in. If you're around the corner, stop the cast, let the mob run. On the first boss, they just made a change that the hook pulls everybody in, not just the target he was chasing. And because of that, I think the bombs need to appear faster. For some reason, on the first boss, the first set of bombs always takes a while to come out, and I feel like people miss them all the time. With the new changes, they need to make the bombs appear quicker. After that first boss, we hit that firing squad. I love the firing squad. I don't think that needs to be changed. I don't think that needs to be removed. I love when somebody forgets and just starts to run up that lane and just gets mowed down. You know, it's a little stall, but the respawn's right behind you, so it's not too big of a deal, and it's always a good laugh. I'm okay with that. I think it's fun. I think it's a cool little thing in the dungeon, and if you hate it, I'm sorry you hate it, but hide behind the wall, don't get shot. The second boss had some changes as well. The change to her jumping on the boat, going from a timer to 66% and 33% is a nice adjustment. It makes the fight a bit more scheduled. If you have cooldowns coming up and she's at 68%, you know not to use them because she's going to be jumping on the boat in a second. So I like that change. I think it's a good change. And while she's on the boat, she does dread volley. Those big spirals that are on the ground, well, they made them smaller. And I think that's great. It reduces unnecessary clutter on the stream. They're already kind of hard to see when you're in or out of them, so this will make it a little bit easier to stay out of them, and I just overall think it's a great change. The next change was mass bombardment, where you get targeted and every 3 or 4 seconds a bomb lands on your location. It's fine. I assume you play it with melee stacking on the tank, like on the tree boss and Algathair, moving together, and casters being far enough out and moving on their own, because melee is the one that needs to stay close, so if you don't stack, it kind of pushes everybody out. So stacking and moving as one is going to make that the easiest process. And if you do it like that, the mechanic becomes not really that detrimental. It doesn't really affect the fight at all. Also, that room is huge. There's so much space to just walk backwards and have those bombs just dropping before you that you can start on one side and move to the other side and you'll be completely fine. The last change they made was fiery ricochet, and provided it's not over-tuned, it's fine. It hits 4 targets with the dot. There's not much damage on that fight, so at least the healers now have something to do. They're not snoozing and just healing the tank, which in some cases the tank can be so self-reliant that you don't even really need to be healing the tank. So at least it gives the healers something to do in that fight. Next, we're moving to the area with all the monkey pirates. Can we please cut the bananas on the floor in half? They suck, they aren't fun to play around. If they let us stun mobs by pulling them onto the bananas, then yeah, we could work with it and we could use it in the fight. But right now, I'm just getting stunned left and right because mobs are on them and I go to move and get stunned by something I can barely see. Let's cut the bananas out. The third boss feels fine to me. There's not too many things on that fight that I'd like to change. Tidal wave is fine, you hide behind the pillar, no harm, no foul. Overall, solid boss. Now, the last boss, I don't think you should need 2 dispels in that. Managing 2 strong dots is challenging and often feels overwhelming when you're trying to heal through slams, you're trying to dispel a target, you're trying to make sure you're not dying if you're the healer and you got it on you, and it could very well be a numbers thing that feels better going into the dungeon with actual gear, but in the beta, that dot feels like it crushes people, and I would rather it just be 1 dot that's stronger than the 2 dots, and that way the healer just has to dispel quickly. It's not necessarily a dispel and a healing check, it's just how fast can you dispel. Make the dot real strong, I don't care about that. I think that if the healer has to react and dispel quick, I think that's a better challenge than just having to dispel spam heals. We went through that with Temple of the Jade Serpent on that last boss. That dot sucked on high tyrannical keys, and this just feels like that again. I'd rather just have 1 dot that you need to quickly dispel in order to keep that player alive. They did change it so that each island has 1 demolisher on it. I think that was a great change. It makes the encounter a little bit more straightforward. You can kill the demolisher, kill the other guy, and you don't have to worry about another demolisher coming up and having to fight that thing again. Overall, I think the changes to the Dread Captain were good. I think the hook change to Chopper felt unnecessary, but it is what it is, we gotta deal with it. Personally, Siege of Boralus is a fun dungeon that with a few minor tweaks could be even better. I'm gonna put Siege in B tier. Overall, it feels fine, but the parts that don't feel fine actually feel really bad. The pull-in one-shot combos, the stun bananas, runners, they all hurt the enjoyment of the dungeon, so for that reason, B tier. Moving on to Grim Batol. Grim Batol ranks as my second to least favorite dungeon in this expansion. The mobs, particularly in the second half, are very unfriendly to melee players. While I don't mind mechanics on trash, it becomes an issue when they constantly take melee out of the fight for extended period. For example, the mob that casts the rings you need to spread for, followed by Ascension which forces you to run back out, creates a frustrating back and forth for melee players and disrupts the flow of combat. First boss is okay, but it can be tough to see which lane is open. They recently increased the time you have to find the empty lane, which was a good change. If you go from one side to the other and then have to go all the way back to the other side, some classes that just use their mobility ability can't get back in time and get slapped. So the added time to get over there was a good change. The second mechanic the boss does, where he puts the circles on everybody, you got to spread out to make sure you're not hitting your teammates. That's a fine mechanic. It's a typical spread out so you don't overlap with anybody. The only issue I see is when you have to move to an empty lane and you have that on you, just becomes kind of annoying. It's not detrimental to the boss fight overall, but it's just annoying. On to the second boss. Second boss has a couple of different abilities. He has Forged Sword and Forged Mace, which are tank busters. And then he has Molten Mace, which is an enrage you need to run for. The name doesn't make sense and gets people killed. I think the name should say Fiery Blaze or Fiery Enrage or something like that, that shows you at a glance that you need to run for this ability. The first time I did the fight, I saw a Forged Mace, Forged Sword, Molten Mace, and was like, oh, it's just another tank buster. And then he just killed me on the Enrage. I think that should be a different name so that people know, okay, this is an Enrage or this is something big that I need to get away from, not have it so similar to his other tank busters that you just take. On to the third boss in Grim Batol. Third boss should only spawn ads on the outskirts and not underneath them. It makes no sense to have ads spawn directly beneath the boss and cause your melee to have to run out or for you to have to move the boss when he'll just start casting and then you can't move him and the ad's directly underneath him. For range, it's probably fine because now you can just AoE and take that ad down. But for melee, it sucks to have to run out and then also kite that mob until someone kills it. Just spawn the ads on the outskirts, have them move a little quicker if that's what you want. But that way players have time to react, melee can keep on the boss while range can take down the ad as it comes in. It just creates a better balance between melee and range in that fight. It allows them all to stay in the fight the whole time. I like the last boss in Grim Batol. It's very straightforward. Don't go in the shadows, stay in the circle, spread out when you need to. The trash leading up to that boss could definitely use some tweaks. The big ads that cast Corrupt should be interruptible or at least stoppable. On high fort keys, it's just gonna nuke whoever it gets. We see it now in the beta where somebody gets targeted by Corrupt and their health just drains. I would hope that they make that interruptible, not interruptible, stoppable. I think with the stun, you should be able to stop it. Because like I said, on higher keys, especially on fort keys, it's just gonna be a death sentence for whoever gets it. So I'd like to see that change. In summary, Grim Batol could benefit from more than a few changes to make it more melee friendly and less confusing, particularly in regard to boss mechanics. Grim Batol is going in D tier for me. I hate having to in and out on mobs as melee, the numerous knockbacks are a pain, enveloping shadows is better but still bad, Corrupt just killing people doesn't make sense, and all of those things make the dungeon not fun. The only saving grace is the little dragon riding to clear packs. I think we see some cool tech with that down the road, like having a prot pally, just beeline it down, grab as many packs as possible, and then bubble taunt and have everyone on the dragon just nuke those packs with the big bombs. That way you can clear half the path with one shot from everyone and then fully clear the rest. But aside from that, it is a D tier dungeon for me. Next up, we got City of Threads. City of Threads is a dungeon I generally like, but it does have its drawbacks. One major issue is the roleplay segments. In a time setting like Mythic Plus, these can feel like they drag on. Also, just like in the other dungeons, there's an abundance of casts and a scarcity of silences. Some mobs can be difficult to control because they start casting again immediately after a stun, which can be frustrating. The first pack that comes to mind is probably the third or fourth pull, where it's the one big character and the two small mobs, and even though they're already kind of grouped, when you do need to move because there's a pool on the ground, it becomes a pain in the ass to interrupt, stun, interrupt to get those guys to all move as one. I like the first boss. I like that mechanic where you have to stack on the tank when she's channeling and then move as one unit as that pool is expanding. I think it creates some spatial awareness, and I do enjoy that aspect of it. What I don't like is being yanked into the boss the second the tank gets there. I think there should be like a half second or a second of leeway for people running in, because it's just a bit jarring. I don't know, it's not really that big of an issue, but I would like to have 1 second where the circle's closing in and you got to get in that circle before it closes, and then you get yanked if you're not in the circle. I just think that makes more sense. I think if you're a caster trying to get that pre-cast off, it gives you that half second of leeway to make sure you get it and then get into the circle. But that's not a big deal. I think that that's just something I would like to see changed. Also, the stun orbs on that boss should have better indicators. It's sometimes hard to tell where they're going as they're just kind of flickering and they show kind of faintly where they are. If you have low settings, I can't imagine you can see them very well. And although I don't think arrows are the right right indicator because I think it'd be very cluttering. I would like to see maybe just some beams, some short lines that show where it's going to go. That way you can position around it a little bit better and a little bit easier. Moving into the city, you got to fight that mob right before you get the perfume so that you can sneak past everything. I like that mob. I don't think that that's a big deal. I wish he kind of skirted back to the side and perfumed you a little quicker, but I don't mind having to fight him to get into the city. What I do mind is when you're fighting one of the Eye of the Queens and you accidentally hit one of the passive mobs and then you're stuck in combat for the rest of the dungeon. You have to find the mob you hit, go back and kill it in order to drop combat. And you kind of need to because you're running around in that dungeon a lot and you can mount. So when you can't mount, it feels terrible. And I don't like the idea that halfway through the dungeon, I got to go back and find somebody that's just off to the side standing there looking at me and kill them in order to get out of combat and be able to mount to go to the next mini boss. Speaking of the mini bosses, the ads on the Eye of the Queen need to have their evade/threat mechanic fixed. Right now, they pop up, you damage them, and then they evade and reset threat, causing you to scramble to grab them all again. You can deal damage while they're standing there, but as soon as they move into combat, they typically evade for a second and drop threat, and they just start attacking someone random. That needs to be fixed where you're building threat while they're standing there. Second boss feels fine after tuning. The icicles were initially a problem, but they're much better now. I would like an indicator on the mob that's tankable, maybe glow or something. That way you're not running back and forth between the two, you just know when to switch. I assume this will be something people make with a weak aura, but it would be nice for Blizz to do it. It's not a major issue as you can pretty easily figure out which mob's casting abilities and which mob is following the tank, but it's a quality of life thing. Third boss feels fine. It's not the most fun boss, but it doesn't feel terrible. It can get a little cluttered, but that's part of the boss mechanic. The trash around it and leading to the last boss are better since they changed the mobs that target random players and cast on them. Those were awful. The first time I went in with that change, I was so happy about it because they would always randomly target my healer and just one-shot them. So I'm glad they changed that. The mobs that knock back and wake up the eggs are annoying. I don't like that there's two different casts that can wake them up. One, if you get hit with the knockback and go into an egg, it pops it open, and the other one just automatically opens an egg around them. And for melee, again, I feel like you're constantly running in and out, trying to evade these swirls, stopping one just for the other one to cast. And it's just a running theme throughout the dungeon that melee is running in and out, and when you are stopping it, they're just casting something else. So those mobs are pretty annoying. The last boss is okay, but the orbs need clearer indicators on their movement direction. Currently, you have to guess where to stand, which isn't ideal. You know the orbs are going to a spot, but if they spread out, you can't tell which one is coming in. At least I haven't noticed, and if you have an orb on your left and behind and they're going to one spot, if you know which one's coming, you can stand on the left, have that back orb come in, and then move to the right and have that left orb come in. But if you don't know, you're kind of just guessing where to go, and it causes you to just have to run that boss kind of around, which is just a pain to deal with. I would just like to see maybe a little arrow on the ground showing which one's coming in. That way you can avoid that one, then avoid the next one, and then avoid the next one. The last thing I'd like to see change on that boss is the AoE you get that shoots the orbs at you. I wish it was a little smaller, not because it's hard to get out, but because the room is pretty big. And if your healer's on one side and you have to get out quickly to the other side, sometimes you can outrange your healer and then you take 3 big shots of damage. So I wish it was a little smaller so you didn't have to spread out so far, and that way the healer could still heal you. If it goes on the healer, they don't need to spend so much time running before they can start healing themselves. So because of things like that, I think a smaller circle would be better. It doesn't have to be much smaller, but just a little bit smaller. Overall, City of Threads is a fun dungeon with a few areas that need polishing to improve the overall experience. I think it sits at a high C, maybe low B for me right now. The RP is tedious. I think the whole follow the images is a cool concept, but it does drag on a little bit after you've done it so many times. Few tweaks and it's a comfortable B, but I think right now it's going to be in C tier. Next up, City of Echoes. City of Echoes I have mixed opinions on. It's got good and bad elements. The mobs generally feel fine, making it one of the few dungeons that don't require excessive kicks and stuns, and that feels great. The death explosion mechanic on the early mobs is annoying, but it's very manageable. You just move out of the way. I also really like the 3 mini bosses at the beginning, as they feel more rewarding than just a bunch of trash leading up to a boss. First boss feels a bit counterintuitive. You need to avoid ground effects that build up around the boss while also not moving him close to ads. So you're kind of stuck dancing in place. It would be better to me if the ground webs from the first cast disappeared when he was doing the second cast. That way, if you're melee heavy, you don't feel like you're out of room so quickly, and people can still fight the ads off in the distance. You're not running the boss around the room trying to avoid ground stuff and ads coming out from all over the place. I really like the ads on the way to the next boss. They have that ability you need to interrupt while the other ones aren't so deadly. The only ad that sucks is the big ad that stuns you for 1 second. I feel like it prevents big pulls because you just unavoidably get stunned for 1 second, and if you have too many mobs, they can just nuke you down. So that 1 second stun feels awful. I wish that wasn't in it. I wish it was stoppable or something, but right now that feels awful to deal with. The alarm beetles might be a problem on higher fort keys, but you can stun them and reset their alert, so they might just normally get stunned throughout pulls and really not be an issue. Now for the second boss. Second boss sucks for range, it sucks for melee. You can't leave the circle, but then have mobs way out in Narnia casting an ability that'll kill 90% of players. They should only cast once and then come in as the next one spawns, so that a silence, a stun, a knockup, or anything causes them to come into the circle guaranteed. Or you should be able to move the boss and the circle that you can stand in towards the mobs, so that way you can kind of kite the boss around and interrupt the mobs and kill the mobs as they're spawning. It just feels like there's little to no counterplay when a mob's on the other side of the room wrapping one of your party members and no one can get there. That's the one thing in the dungeon that I would really like to see adjusted. I think the last boss is really cool. It's easily the hardest in the dungeon. It has a lot of overlapping high damage mechanics that I think need to be tuned down a little bit, or at least spread out so they don't overlap so much, because it puts a lot of stress on the healer, who is also doing a lot of mechanics, trying to kill mobs coming in, prepare for the root, do all these different things, and also deal with poisons and which way they're going to go out. I think there's just a lot going on that when it happens all at once, it's a bit much, and I'd like to see that spaced out a little bit better. All in all, I'm a big fan of like 60% of the dungeon. I think the beginning is fun with the mini bosses. You have a lot of options to pull for percent. The ads throughout the dungeon are generally not bad. There are casts you can let go off and a few which you can't, which feels better than a lot of the dungeons with multiple high damage casts. The last boss has cool mechanics, but it can be overwhelming when they're all overlapping and you're trying to point your poison, kill your mob, get rooted, and not get sucked into her ability. So there's a lot going on in the second half of the dungeon that I'm not a huge fan of, but I really like the first half of the dungeon. I like to put it in C because I like the first half of the dungeon, but because of how bad the second boss is and how quickly the last boss can become overwhelming with overlapping mechanics, I'm gonna put it in D tier for right now. Next up, we got Dawnbreaker. Dawnbreaker is easily my least favorite dungeon. I hate the dragon riding off the dragon on the ships and off the ships and back and forth and back and forth. It just feels like you're constantly like mounting and going somewhere, killing 3 or 4 mobs, mounting and going somewhere, killing a few mobs, and it just kind of carries that way throughout the whole dungeon. And I particularly don't enjoy that. For the first boss, my problem with her is that the AoE always feels bigger than it shows. There's been times that I'm clearly not near it and still get blown up, and I just don't understand why. I feel like they need to fix that range so that it accurately is depicted in that big shadow orb. And then also, whenever she's about to die, she always does that cast. So she's at 1%, you kill her, but you still got to go fly in circles until that cast goes off before you can go to the next ship. And that's annoying. Just let her die. After her, you go to the town that's way too cluttered. It's almost impossible to pull a pack without inadvertently pulling another, and most mobs in the area don't even give percent, so you're just wasting time. I think they should cut the amount of mobs in the town in half or give them a percent. Even if it's a low percentage, it would at least make accidental pulls feel less useless because, hey, at least we got some percent out of it. Now, once you're into town, you need to kill lieutenants before the boss, and because of all the extra packs everywhere, you have very limited space unless you clear everything. And most of the lieutenants or the ads around them tend to have mechanics you need to spread out for, which you can't really do. One lieutenant shoots a shadow orb that blows up on impact and deals damage. The further out it explodes, the less damage it deals to the party, but you're just in such a tight spot that you don't have enough room to let it get out to the point where it's not going to deal devastating damage to the party. I was doing a fortified 3 the other day, and it was going a decent distance out and still dealing like 3 million damage to everybody in the group. There's just not enough room to have a mechanic like that in that town. Then you go onto the boss and you deal with more of the same. It's cluttered, and now the boss does all the abilities that the lieutenants did. So you're still having spread out mechanics in an area that you can't really spread out. They should have an area that clears out after you kill the lieutenants so that you can at least fight the boss with some room. After the town, back on your mount, back on a ship. Now you're fighting Roshan, the last boss. I don't like Roshan's wave mechanic, but I like that we see something different than the usual boss mechanic. So even though I don't like it, I like that they're trying new things. Rashawn's recent increase to the stun duration was unnecessary in my opinion. The stun that hits you when you get hit by the wave, it was 1 second and now it's 1.5 seconds. It feels like they didn't really need to add that, but it's also not the worst thing in the world. I'm not a fan of the fact that you need to use bombs on the boss. It feels a bit excessive. I would like more character play than just dropping bombs on the boss. I would like it to be like 80-20 player damage and bombs. That way you're still dealing damage and then a bomb drops, somebody goes out and grabs it. But having 2 or 3 bombs that people are just running in the whole time is not fun. You don't get to play your class. Let us play our class with a few added things into it. After he takes a bunch of damage from the bomb, he takes off and you have to hop back on your mount and follow a ship that's somehow too fast and slow at the same time. The constant dismounting and mounting just makes it feel clunky. In Nokud and Dragonflight, you mounted, you ran to an area, you were there for quite a while, you fought a boss. In this one, you're mounted, off mount, on mount, off mount, on mount, off mount, throughout the whole dungeon that it just feels like, all right, back and forth, and it's just not enjoyable. If I could change 5 things, they would be reducing the back and forth on ships, keeping the second boss fight on the ship, you shouldn't have to fly off and get out of this range and fly in a circle for 10 seconds, cut down on the town population, clear an area after killing the lieutenants, and killing Rashawn on the boat to avoid the chase. Overall, Dawnbreaker is my least favorite dungeon and I'm putting it in F tier. If you like this dungeon, please tell me why you like this dungeon. Lastly, we got Stonevault. Stonevault is a fun but challenging dungeon. The first couple times I did this dungeon, the casts were out of control, but it felt better the last few runs. So I'm not sure if they adjusted it or if the groups I was in just got better at stopping it. Edna, the first boss, is tough. The beams and the tank buster coming at the same time are kind of insane. They need to cut that damage in half. It hits for like 8 million. Also, sometimes the pillars appeared for each player and other times only for a couple. While it feels better with only a couple of pillars, I suspect it's supposed to be for everyone. That's just a tough mechanic. That first boss is tough. There's a lot of damage going out to the party at one time, and you really need the healer to be on top of it. And it's so early in the dungeon that I guess it's nice because you know pretty early on if you're not going to do the dungeon, but it is right now a very, very strong boss. The mobs throughout the dungeon aren't too bad. There are a couple big casts and fears you need to stop and some tank busters that kind of feel out of nowhere, but a lot of them are manageable. I do like how they did the molten frontal with the big orange ball that glows and grows until it fires. Everyone knows what it is and it's very hard to miss. The second boss with the crystals is a bit strong. The stacking debuff was a pain to deal with. I know they recently changed it from a dot to a debuff that just increases the damage of the explosion when you kill the crystal shard, which I think was a good change. The damage feels more manageable when 2 go off since you aren't fighting to heal people up in between the 2 hits. You just have one lump sum of damage you have to heal through. The fight felt a lot worse at the start of the beta because I don't think players realized that they needed to gather the void clouds like in Nokud to break the shield faster or kill the crystals to weaken the shield, but now that more people understand the fight, it seems to be a lot smoother. The third boss is probably the hardest next to Edna. The recent changes made to this boss weren't necessary. Deconstruction now deals damage to all players, and those within the circle just take massive damage. I don't think that was a necessary change. It was already hard enough to get out of the circle. The exhaust vent change was fine. It's easy enough to avoid those. I wasn't a fan of changing the puddle damage. I feel like you're constantly trying to avoid stuff that entire dungeon, and sometimes you have to touch one of the puddles in order to get out of the deconstruction circle. So it's just, it didn't feel necessary. Molten Metal's slow not being dispellable anymore is a good change. It doesn't lock out classes without a dispel or force you to bring one that does have a dispel, and the cast is interruptible, so it balances out. The Molten Wave change is annoying because it hits you with the wave right after avoiding deconstruction. The first time I did that, we all avoided deconstruction and then immediately got hit by the wave after, and it felt like we just avoided something. Why is something coming directly at us when there's only one spot for us to stand to safely be out of the way of deconstruction? So not a huge fan of the Molten Wave change. The boss was already hard before, and these changes made it tougher without much justification for why. The mobs leading to the last boss feel standard, typical interruptions and frontal mechanics. I do think frontals need to be more obvious across the board. Having just a normal cast bar is poor design. The Molten Lava Ball is a great example of how a frontal should look. Everyone sees it, everyone knows to move. The last boss is cool. I like the idea of using the black holes to remove the dot. Takes a little bit of stress off the healer, feeling like they have to dispel something. It's kind of on the player. It's a little bit more personal responsibility. Of the 2 abilities in the fight, you would think the big circle that you take out would be the big damage thing, but it's a dot that gets put on you kind of unknowingly that ticks away and needs to be brought to a portal. Overall, Stonevault a fun dungeon, but so far it has been a pug killer. With a good group, it's a B tier dungeon, but if you're pugging, it's a low C, high D. I've seen so many groups fall apart at Edna only 30 seconds in, but if you can get past that and you have a solid group, it's a pretty fun dungeon. And there you have it. That is every dungeon in the War Within and how they feel to play, what I think should change on them. And if you enjoyed the video, like the video. If you have a dungeon that you really like that I didn't like, tell me why you liked it. Till next time, guys.